So I suppose the inflation problem in Australia is really partly domestic driven, but also, it's really a lot of global factors as well. We know that there's these sort of overlapping supply chain issues that started with the pandemic. At the moment we've got lots of Beijing and Shanghai shut down, so that's only exacerbating some of those pandemic related supply chain issues. And then there's the war in Ukraine. So all of those things have really added to the global impetus for inflation. But what we're now seeing is that domestic inflation is really starting to pick up. And that's really clear in the latest report, where headline inflation was at 5.1%, and the trimmed mean measure, which is the RBA's favoured measure, was at 3.7. Now, the RBA spent 5 years from 2016 to 2021 where inflation was below the band. They were essentially missing their target, and now within just a few quarters it's well above the band with trimmed mean at 3.7. So the RBA really does have an inflation problem, and I think that when you look at the upgrade to their forecast in the latest statement of monetary policy, this has really come as a bit of a surprise to them. So it means they're going to have to move quite quickly on rates. So we've lifted our forecast for interest rates. We obviously got the first one this month, and now we think they'll raise rates nearly every month until the middle of next year, when they get the cash rate to around 2.25%, 2.5%. So it's a really steep trajectory. I mean, we're not as steep as the market. The market's expecting rates to go even higher. But it will certainly have implications for the broader economy, but obviously for housing.
Yeah, absolutely. And looking at the CoreLogic data historically, when we track what happens to the home value index against changes in the official cash rate, it's pretty established that it's an inverse relationship. So when interest rates start to rise, we expect that growth in housing to come down, and it'll probably be the factor that ticks most of Australian housing markets into that downswing phase. There'll be different extents of this depending on how expensive the market is, how much investor concentration there is. But even from the RBA, we saw in their modelling this expectation of a 200 basis point rise in the cash rate, creating a 15% decline in real property prices. Now, I think for a lot of people who've been struggling to get into the housing market, that's a moment where maybe you sit back and you rub your hands together and think, oh, prices are going to come down, the 20% deposit hurdle or whatever deposit hurdle you're looking at is going to come down. But what might be important to consider for those first home buyers is the fact that at the end of the day, this is about an increase in interest costs as well. So even if your deposit is lower, your loan is lower, and the price of the property is cheaper, the cost of the mortgage could mean you end up spending more money overall. It was really interesting when we looked at these housing affordability metrics at the onset of COVID, and the fact that in some ways rental costs were becoming lower for those in our biggest rental markets of Sydney and Melbourne. I think maybe what people hadn't expected was just how much rental affordability constraints would flow into regional Australia. And that's where now we're seeing the portion of income required to service rent at a record high for the regions, as the capital city markets are still sitting slightly lower. So I think that's probably one of the main challenges or most urgent issues within the affordability space, is how do we help people, particularly on lower incomes and in the regions, with their housing costs?
Because that's something that's going to be a longer term challenge, isn't it? Now that we're seeing this flexible working and sort of remote working by really capital city workers or workers getting capital city incomes, but then moving to the regions and living there, and to some degree displacing those longer term residents, and that flexible working is probably not going to go away. So this looks like it is going to be a longer term challenge for the regions. Always good to chat about housing with you, Eliza.
Yeah, you too, Felicity. It'll be interesting to see what the next report results look like.
Yeah, absolutely.